Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on a Saturday. I'm Dr. Sakina Al-Haddad, and today's work is led by me in collaboration with Dr. Jude Williams and Chantel Warren.
So, what's the science of learning? The science of learning is really a body of research devoted to understanding learning, and this often occurs in many disciplines, right? So research findings might come from psychology, the learning sciences, education, neuroscience, and so on. Now, the science of learning is often translated by researchers and educators for educators, but it's done less so for students. So some of the notable examples are, like the Learning Scientists blog. Yeah, they often translate it for students, but those are, again, often educators and researchers translating for students. And so in this program, we sought to do so with students, for students. This is where the Leading Learning program comes in. We used a hybrid design comprising of social design-based experiment and students as partners as our overarching methodologies, and participatory design research and design thinking as productive methods for collective knowledge building and creation. The combination of which emerged as the Leading Learning program and ultimately the Leading Learning collective. We'll talk through each of these as we go through the talk today. In social design-based experiment, or SDBE, the educators and researchers ultimately work with the people who have specifically faced injustices, marginalization, and so on. So there's a real focus on equity. And we do this to understand and directly address the experiences to liberate individual and collective agency. So with SDBE, we specifically set out with a wide cast recruitment net. We sent invitations to students who have volunteered, even if it's once, in supporting students. We sought to enable participation of a diverse collective. And so in the EOI, we asked about their discipline, one or two aspects of their experience in supporting students at Griffith as most valuable to them. We also asked what their motivation was for participating in this program. And so we aimed to empower students with the science of learning, but not in a, hey, learn all about this, we know everything and we will now impart this to you, but rather to have a critical dialogue about the science of learning as we collectively build knowledge together. We applied the process of participatory design methods as enacted through design thinking. And so like SDBE, PDR is committed to centering and understanding how cultural historicity, power, relational dynamics can shape the processes of partnering and the possible forms of learning that emerge in and through them. And finally, this is particularly important when considering how epistemic diversity influences knowledge creation and building. These principles really help us create conditions for educational dignity and meaningful participation beyond just parity of participation. So to this end, we use the process of participatory design thinking to shift students from that of learners into a leading position of change. So student partners are not only engaged in critical interrogation of the science of learning, they also bring in their knowledges and experience and prior learning. They also become creative producers of knowledge by translating and creating their own ways of communicating this science to other learners. So this was the full emergent program. At orientation, we ascertained collective purpose and goals. And of course, as part of SDBE, we explicitly explored power. And then we went into the collective knowledge building phase.
So the knowledge building phase consists of learning about the science of learning, and we categorize that into three main categories: understanding learning, planning learning, and expanding and deepening learning. So in understanding learning, they learn about attention, memory, and its role in learning, but also they learn about how we gain knowledge, that is epistemic cognition. And each week, or each, category will be associated with a myth buster. So in this particular week, they learn about busting the myth of multitasking. So we'll go back to the next topic, which is planning learning. So in planning learning, they learn about ultimately cognitive load theory in explaining why we have to really plan our learning, and then the evidence base that constitutes that. So the science behind scheduling, space practice, sleep, and learning spaces. And then in expanding and deepening learning, they learn about retrieval practice, elaborative interrogation, concrete examples, and reflective practice. And of course, in terms of mythbusters, we cannot do myth busting without actually busting the myth of learning styles, which of course that resonated a lot with students because they did believe in learning styles myth, quite a lot of them actually. So this was an interesting one. So once they've learned about the science of learning, for each of these categories, they'll have a workshop, a design workshop ultimately, with us, the facilitators, where we will collaboratively problem solve a design issue related with that particular topic. So for example, in planning learning, the students come up with an issue that students might come across in learning, and they will apply what they have learned in planning learning to support student learning in that way.
So we had phased alternations of asynchronous tasks and synchronous sessions. And then we shifted into the phase of student-led collective knowledge building. So students educated staff on their experiences and goals in supporting student learning. Staff also mentored students for leadership in participatory design thinking. And then we introduced design challenges, and this was where we had the broader staff network to collaborate with the collective to problematize and solve certain higher education design challenges. And then the students led the design thinking sessions with staff. That was awesome. And then finally, the Leading Learning Collective, so that's all of the student staff partners, co-design, co-create resources to support student learning.
Given the democratic principles of student-staff partnerships, students were given full agency as to how they would like to support student learning with the science of learning. So now they take on the role of peer educators and chose which topics they'd like to work on and how they'd like to go about doing that. So then they actually applied the process of research-informed participatory design thinking themselves, whereby they chose which topics to work on and how to deal with it. So for example, with this topic of dealing with distractions, they went out of their way to empathize with students, not themselves, but their peers, to understand how students experience this and what do they currently do. To do that, they surveyed and interviewed students from diverse backgrounds. So, students with carer, work responsibilities, financial challenges, neurodiverse students, and so on, because they felt that when they reviewed what was available in the wider internet and in resources, that these perspectives were often lacking. And then they used that to converge with what the research says so that they can identify key issues, misconceptions, and so on to target resources towards that. They then brainstormed together as to how to best communicate in engaging and effective ways to students across the life cycle. So at this stage, they have prototyped some elements of that, and we'll share some of those elements with you. The students decided that they wanted to create a website, and so they will pull the resources together in terms of supporting student learning. Here are some of the elements of the designed artifacts. So we collaborated with students as to some interactive tools. So here's an example where students have designed this whole thing, including the graphics and the information that's associated with that, that's curated based on research evidence. So here's another example. This is the model, as you know, of self-regulated learning. And again, it takes students through what each of these entails, but also how they might go about actually enacting self-regulated learning in this way, in a very stepped order. Here's another example of a video that the students have made.
Hi, I'm Syra.
I'm Rachel.
And we are student partners with the Leading Learning Science program.
While we were working and chatting with the other student partners in this program, we realised we often experience similar struggles with learning, especially during COVID. I wasn't the only one dealing with mental overload and finding it hard to concentrate.
And I wasn't the only one with lots of responsibilities outside of university and a lot on my plate. It helped me knowing that I wasn't the only one who was struggling with studying.
It was also helpful to learn why we experienced things like mental overload and how to help address it.
Learning about the concept of cognitive load theory helped me to better understand myself and how I learn. Also, it helped me to understand why sometimes I struggle to study and what I need to do in order to study smarter and not harder.
So, what is cognitive load theory in a nutshell? So, what does this look like for learners? Sometimes when I'm studying, I find myself rereading the same sentence over and over. I get distracted and start doodling on my iPad, my mind wanders off and I start thinking about what kind of coffee or drink I want to make myself. Now that I know a bit about cognitive load theory, I can now recognize when my brain is overloaded and not processing any new information. When I have brain fog, it's generally because the material I'm trying to learn is too complex, meaning my intrinsic load is too high. The best way for me to address this is by breaking the content into separate chunks that build on each other, small chunks of new information. I also use scaffolding as a learner. That's where I ask my lecturer for examples of how a problem can be solved, or I find a worked example online. Once I see the solution, I find it easier to try and solve the next problem by myself. Our brains process new information by connecting it to information we already know. So, that's how I deal with intrinsic overload as a learner. Sarah will share her experience with extraneous overload.
I experience extraneous overload when there are too many distractions in the environment where I'm trying to learn. I work, I volunteer, and I'm a carer. It's been really difficult for me to study online from home. I can't really create a distraction-free space in my home unless it's when everyone is asleep, but then my sleep is impacted and that's when I start feeling anxious. I've had to rework my schedule to block out chunks in my day where I can either come to university and study in a quiet space, or I can go to a park or a cafe. I've also started to better utilize support from family and friends and the community to help me manage my extraneous overload so that I can help me to study smarter and not harder.
So I thought it was really great that as the programme developed, as we all contributed to it, that diversity really resulted in a rich translation of the science of learning into resources and materials for other learners.
Definitely, I completely agree with you, Jude. For me, being a part of this program that was designed specifically with epistemic diversity in mind, it really allowed us to build relationships, both student to student and student to staff, and this sense of group cohesion that I just haven't really seen that much in my university life before. So it was such a meaningful process that was designed in the program. And starting off with that collective knowledge building phase where we all had equal access to resources and we could go and learn the science of learning in our own time and in a way that worked for us, to then come to the program with an equal footing where we worked collectively on the design of these resources that you mentioned. It was just a fabulous way for us to build our confidence as individuals, but also our confidence with other students and staff as well. And I think we all know of a bad experience that we've had in a group project, whether that be with other students or with staff members. So knowing that it's possible to have an equitable group by design is just something that's so fabulous. So it really allowed us to not only build this confidence, but to feel a sense of legitimacy as actual partners in the program, and the sense of belonging that I think really starts to touch on those notions of power as well. What do you think about that, Sarah?
Yeah, definitely, Hayley. You focused on perceived power imbalances and that sense of belonging, and that really took me back to when we were completing the collaborative autoethnography process, and we started having a conversation about our perceived power asymmetries and how we all had conceptions as student partners of not belonging at the start of the program. We then collectively realised that this was a largely misplaced sense of doubt and unworthiness, particularly for those of us who didn't come from a hard science background or a psychology background. But then as we further continued our discussion, we realised we are all student partners of a great multidisciplinary team, and we later found out that this was deliberately done through design. We were deliberately chosen for our diverse thinking and our diverse lived experiences. And for me personally, I really love this because we would often be presented with the exact same information, but would produce completely different results. We were able to replicate that same richness of learning, and it was done in a safe and online environment where we felt encouraged as genuine student partners and we didn't just feel like students.
Yeah, that's so true.
That's great, definitely.